Welcome everyone to the second part of the Telling Your Story training. I wanted just to give you a little background about why we're having this training. Some of you might know, we had a first session last week, and the idea behind this training was that in our work as water and climate advocates, and more broadly as environmental advocates or justice advocates, usually we have developed really good skills for our strategies, right? Our organizations have our frameworks and our strategic planning and our logic models, and we've developed, in different ways that skill. And a complement to that is, how do we tell the story? And so what we've heard is that, sometimes it's hard to actually convey how our organizations are making a difference in the world. And so that's why we started this idea of a training around telling your organization's story. And in our first session, we went through some frameworks and principles and some guidebooks and tools that can guide this work. But in reality, storytelling is such a soft skill and such an art that we thought it would make more sense to have a conversation. And so therefore, we came up with the idea of having a roundtable, invite some great panelists that have experience dealing with strategic communications from different perspectives. And so that's why we're here today to talk about what are some of the principles, what are some of the experiences around telling an organization story that we can all share and learn from. And so I'm really, really honored and excited to present our panelists here today. We have Ayanna McLeod joining us. Ayanna is serving as the executive director of the Bayou City Waterkeeper, where she works on wetland protection and urban water management in the greater Houston area. She has over 20 years of experience in nonprofit administration, leading programs and building infrastructure for environmental and cultural institutions. So welcome, Ayanna. We have Ashley Fairbanks. Ashley is an Anishinaabe writer, artist, and organizer. And she's the creative director at 100% Campaign. She trains people on anti-racist work and does strategic communications and design work, and runs social media and narrative work for campaigns and nonprofits. She has over 15 years of experience doing digital strategy work, design, art direction, and messaging. And she's a collaborator with us at the Water Hub. And then we also have Marce Gutierrez Gaundiz. Hope that I pronounced that right. Marce is an environmental justice advocate who began her career working in commercial fishing and aquaculture. And she serves as the executive director of Azul, a nonprofit who works with Latinx communities on protecting coast and oceans across the nation. And she has helped design and implement a statewide network of marine protected areas, as well as a sustainability and marketing program for local fisheries. And she also led the work to advance a campaign to ban single-use plastics here in California. And she'll talk about some of the projects that Azul and her have been working on. And then we also have our colleague, Scott Gordon. Scott is a retired professional from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA's Southeast Regional Office, Region 4 in Atlanta, which oversees most of the southern states. He was with EPA for 36 years, working on compliance and enforcement areas. And he received the highest career achievement at EPA, a Lifetime Leadership Award post-retirement. And since he retired, he's been serving as an advisor for the Environmental Protection Network, which is a network of former EPA officials that provide advice to nonprofits and advocates working on environmental issues. I also have Sarah Bucci, our director of media, and Jessica, our director of digital, supporting us today for the webinar. So welcome everyone, welcome all of our panelists. And I'm just gonna get us started with the question of what brought each of you to this work. What's your entry point to organizational storytelling? Why do you think it's important that we tell an organization's story in the first place? And I'm going to start with you, Ayana, and then I'll go to Ashley.
Thanks, Jose. Well, it's great to be here with you all, with panelists and with everyone, all the attendees coming in from different places and in our country, and just happy to be in this space with you. So I am, as Jose said, I'm based in Houston, Texas, and I always think it's so good to be reminded of like where we're rooted at and where we're based at in these virtual moments. In terms of my point of entry into the work, you know, I have a creative background. I am a fourth generation artist, and I've worked in arts and culture for most of my life. The pivot into environmental work was in recent years. And so what I've found is a lot of the people that are leading environmental organizations don't always look like me. And so as we do this work, and we are creating points of entry for our community, especially in a place like Houston, how the barrier around action, advocacy, and engagement is really around, so often is around storytelling. And so with us, we do work around environmental advocacy and water justice issues. It's really about action. So often this work around environmental advocacy is around creating change and getting people to act in policy change, advocacy change, organizing. But for me, what I'd like to really focus on is you can't create change and get people to act until you make connection with them around the story that you're telling. And so I think that I'm really interested in working around action, change, and policy, but taking a step back to think about what are the stories we've been telling. What is the language that we're using? And does that truly reflect our communities that we're serving? And just really being intentional about these access points or points of entry that we're building to engage community. So.
Yes, thank you so much, Ayana. What are the narratives that we're trying to change, and what are the dominant narratives? Is something that we've been thinking about over and over as we engage with these issues. How about you, Ashley? What brought you to this organizational storytelling, and why is it important?
Yeah, Bonjour, Asanawikwe Indigenous. My name is Ashley Fairbanks. And yeah, what brought me to this work? So throughout my career, I've cycled back and forth between like electoral and issue organizing, and then like nonprofit work. And I'm also an artist. I do installation artwork and writing. And I think that I don't see like any silos between all of that work. It's all interconnected to me. And so there was a fundamental disconnect from the kind of work funders expected us to be proposing and the way that I saw work that would be impactful in my community. You know, a lot of nonprofits where I grew up were kind of just stuck in a rut of doing the same kinds of work over and over again. So the storytelling component really came in as a way of pushing organizations to go beyond the limit of what we thought was possible. And you can't, there's kind of the chicken and the egg with funding, right? Where you can't get the funding to do the different work until you show them something. So it was a lot of like, let's play around and do what we can without a budget, without big grants, and then tell the story of how that work was successful and use that to catalyze more funding. So that's what draws me to it.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. We'll put a pin on that funder, you know, nonprofit and community relationship, because it's definitely something to reflect more on. but yeah, highlighting that we need to be creative in how we tell the stories of our communities. How about you, Marce? What brought you to this work, and why is it important to you?
Buenos dias. Hi, thank you so much for the invite. I'm very excited to be here. I will say I probably started doing it without knowing that I was doing it or what to call it or something to that effect. Very much as a placemaking situation. The ocean movement has changed quite a bit in the last couple of years, but it's still one of those places that really hasn't caught up with the reality of the environmental justice movement, of the changing dynamics. And so frequently found ourselves as either the only Latinx person, et cetera, which in California is quite crazy. And so it just started as a means to connect, really. It started as a means to find other folks, to see other folks, to see yourself in it. I just kind of was thinking about how I could reach to folks that weren't looking into this, what my family, my friends, et cetera, especially monolingual English, Spanish speakers would be like paying attention to. And before you knew it, we were, very much very immersed in the arts and that artist storytelling. But it was a little bit of a slippery slope, one that I'm very happy that we took, but it's an exciting road.
Mm-hmm. I feel like that may be the story for many of us, that we were drawn into this storytelling work without really knowing, just finding alternatives to elevate our causes or our organizations, goals and whatnot, and then we were drawn into or thrown into working in art and had to develop those skills. And Scott, you probably have a very different experience from your time at EPA. How did you get more involved into how an organization communicates, and why do you think it's important?
Thank you, Jose, and thank you for everybody who is on the session today. I look forward to our conversations. My education, I'm a chemical engineer. And as a classically trained engineer, there's nothing that I like better than problem solving. And once I got into the environmental field, there were just a bevy of problems that needed to be solved. The things that I saw quite early was that there was no way for the sides to actually connect in a meaningful way to move towards solutions without effective communications and understanding the stories on both sides of those equations. There's difficulties on all sides, and without trying to move beyond a place where you can actively communicate and share ideas and thoughts, there were no solutions. So I've pushed myself further and further into that world of storytelling on all sides. And I stressed it even in my latter days of the government, that we have to understand those other footprints that people walk in to fully understand how to truly solve those problems at their core level and make sure that people are satisfied to the point that it can be that the problems can be addressed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm gonna just highlight that communications it's a two-way stream, if you will, and so many times we're thinking about what we want to communicate, but don't think about what the others are trying to communicate, and it's meant to be, like you said, an active process, and that's why I think it's really important to and as we were preparing for this conversation, we talked about this, to have a philosophy, kind of like a set of values before we get into the tactics of what works. These are the ways in which a storytelling, kind of like strategy can look like. Behind that, what is our approach to communications, to partnerships? So I'm going to go back to you, Scott, and ask, what have you seen? It's a successful philosophy to communications between communities and decision makers, for example. And what's an example, more concretely, of organizational communications that has been successful or that has had challenges, but that you've been part of?
Well, Jose, as you mentioned earlier, I've spent the last 3 years working with the Environmental Protection Network, and I've got to lose some of my federal bureaucracy and the stiffness of that regulatory process to be able to truly communicate with folks. I'm working right now with a group in Puerto Rico, and classically, when I'm asked to intervene, the community groups are very upset. They've been disenfranchised for years. The impacts don't seem to be getting any better, and no one's telling them anything. I sat down with those leaders in the community, and we tried to really talk through all the things that the community believed that were wrong, and then we moved to that next phase of what to do about it. And they had really never taken that active role in trying to communicate the needs of the community and have an active voice in the community for the solutions. I will tell you very successfully, we decided our final analysis was we translated a lot of our activities to the community because it was a Hispanic community that I was dealing with, and my Spanish is really no good at all. But once we got a full connection to the community that we knew we were talking about with a unified voice, we were able to invite the agency leadership into the community to actually put foot on the ground. And once you allow individuals to see the problems themselves, it breaks down a lot of those walls. And they don't have to try to understand that story, they can feel that story themselves. So they're having next week an open session with the Department of Justice, who's trying to work through a negotiation to solve some of their infrastructure and stormwater problems in the community. And I'm hopeful that it's going to be a very successful meeting. So those are active things that once we got beyond the pain and the frustration and moved it into problem solving tools and an active story that the community needed to tell, that it really made huge differences quickly.
That resonates so much. I mean, so many times communities have been burdened with many top-down decisions. And so then when there's a communications, there's so much history and so much frustration. And then on the other end, agencies might be just isolated from communities. And so starting to connect those dots can take a lot of work in terms of emotional burden. But that's the work of rebuilding trust, which is, to me, essential to environmental justice work, is how do we restore trust. So I'll go to you, Marce. What has been your philosophy or approach, and what has been a successful example of organizational storytelling that you've been part of?
Thank you. So the values and the values have evolved. I will be honest. When I first started Azul, I didn't really have a good enough understanding of everything that was at work. I had ideas of what wasn't working. I didn't have enough training or knowledge or understanding about systemic issues, issues of power, racism, etc., let alone the philanthropic field, etc. So I was very very Pollyannish a little bit, and that kind of made it very easy to get drawn into things that weren't my work. And so it took a long time to figure out that my work wasn't in being an EDI consultant or a diversity consultant for organizations out there that are very happy to be oh, can you come and talk to me about this and that? And I wasn't, and I know they mean well, but I wasn't doing the work in community with community, which is where I wanted to do. And so that was the wake-up call. That was a turning point. And so it's, making sure that we're in community with community, that we are not being sort of tokenized, or we're not tokenizing other people, but more importantly, making it welcome and an inviting movement, right? And so this all started because in California and that was probably the moment that things changed for me. In California, we're trying to do a bag ban, single-use plastic bag ban, and the narrative was, and I kid you not, I heard this from other folks, from lobbyists, from even staff at legislators' offices. Well, we can't do that because Latinos don't know how to use reusable bags. And so I'm like, what is so hard about that? And this was like a pervasive conversation. And obviously it wasn't actually, for the most part used by Latinx folks. And in my mind, I just like, my grandmother had a bag. My grandmother had a bag that I've used, that she's used to mark, et cetera. And so we built a whole thing around it. And so I'll bring out, because obviously it's like my thing, but we build this whole campaign around it. And it's like, go back to your roots, leave plastic behind. And this is like the most famous grandma bag with the strong, hand, etc. But this is what like all of a sudden started connecting with people, because it wasn't like, well, blah, 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 plastic. No, it made sense. People connected. And so we're always looking for that connection. And more importantly, it was very important for us, because it's like, this is where we are leading. This is where we have been doing this for generations, and other people all over the world, right? But like this idea of plastic, and this idea that you're coming to tell us how to do things, and that we need to be taught, and like the condescension that comes with that, etc., is really what puts people off, right? So just having the idea that like, this is ours, we know it, we know how to do it, we've led on this, is very welcoming to folks, right? What could be a fairly like alienating place. And so what we're always looking for is like, what is that place, what is that ambience, message, etc., that is that is real, that is authentic, and that actually makes people feel at home in either this movement or a new movement or the space, etc. And that's always been our idea. So it changes, right? Sometimes it's music, sometimes it's graphics, sometimes it's word, but it's always looking for that welcoming space.
I love that, and that makes me think about like a specific part of the storytelling framework that we were talking about last session, which is the story of self, us, and now, and how the story of self is about looking inside of you and looking into your values, meaning looking into what has value for you. And I remember my grandmother and even my mom having that bag, and it was not because of oceans, it was not because of that, but that's where you need thread the needle between the story of self, your family, and the story of us and now. So meeting the moment, and to some extent, giving new meanings to all things. I love that. Ashley, how about you? I mean, your work, I think, is at the intersection of this, like identity and at the same time meeting the moment. You were sharing about some cool projects infusing hope and positivity into climate justice. But what is your philosophy and approach, and what's an example of a project that you're working on?
Yeah, I feel like there's a few things I try to like, kind of wake up and ground myself in every day. And one of those is being really conscious of the fact that most people don't wake up caring about the issues that we care about. They care about like paying their bills and getting their kids to school, and they have anxieties about things that are really real parts of their life. So making sure that I ground all of the communications work I do and the idea of like how do I tell people that this is important to them? How do I meet them where they're at in a way without being condescending? I was raised like in the projects, like super low income, and my sister lives on the reservation and like has 5 kids and works at a gas station, and I'm like, I have to like ground myself in the honesty of, is everything I'm saying, like, would she roll her eyes at it? Would it be bullshit to her? Like, like, because if I can't meet her honestly there, I don't really know who I'm talking to. Like, I'm preaching to the choir. And so that's kind of my central guiding light is just really trying to be accessible. One of my mentors, Ricardo Levins Morales, says this thing like, if we're really going to do like revolutionary work, it has to be accessible to a 2nd grader. He has a great curriculum in it. You should look him up, like about how we talk to talk to children even about environmental justice, and labor rights and things like that. And then yeah, I'm very focused on hope right now, because you know, one of my main goals in my work right now is making sure people want to take action on the climate crisis and pass substantial policies, elect people who will do that, take action in their own lives, you know, and often like put themselves at risk on the front lines. Um, and so part of doing that is like no one is going to fight for a future that they don't feel like is worth fighting for. And
Mhm.
so I think like following, I was just in this great year-long kind of program called the Global Messaging Program with Anat Shankar-Osario, who's done like amazing work on the race class narrative. And so we did a research project as part of that that led me to develop a thing called Climate of Possibility. You can check it out at climateofpossibility.org. And it's really about how we use hope in climate communications. I did a language analysis of like basically all of the major environmental justice organizations over the past 3 years and saw how frequently people were telling stories of hope. And it was a very depressing amount. So I'm really trying to help people find their way and find hopeful stories because just psychologically speaking, that is what motivates people. So.
Mm. Thank you for doing this work. That resonates so much with me. When I first started working on environmental issues, I started working with a very what they call the big greens, so national NGO, and their campaign around climate was kind of like grounded on fear, on kind of like alarming. You've seen that, that type of messaging of like, oh, this is really bad for everyone and for the economies. And I was like, and that was my reaction. I was like, the people out there that are trying to make ends meet don't care about this, like, because in their day-to-day life they don't even know if they have security, food security, or if their lives are at risk. And so it's you're basically talking to yourself when you're saying, oh, the economy, or our
Well,
livelihoods.
so I have to kind of dispute a point there too. A lot of us assume that people who have these issues in their lives don't care about climate, but they do. Like when you look at the research, especially research that Pew has done over the last few years, like 68% of people in developed countries identify the climate crisis as a major issue that they think about frequently. It's an increasing point of anxiety, especially for like Gen Z folks and millennials. So they care about it, they just don't know how to take action. And what
Exactly.
happens is that our like doom gloom climate talk makes them not want to take action or feel disempowered to take action. So what we have to do is put in hope so that they can see, oh wait, there is actually a path to victory here. Like we've come
Mhm.
together in the past to solve big hard things, and we can do that again going forward.
Yeah, and yeah, my point is that how you frame the message is really important. How you convey and how you communicate what you're saying. So let me go to you, Ayana, because I know that you've been thinking a lot about how to shift narratives and communications from your perspective. So what's your philosophy and approach, and what has been an example that you've been working on?
Yeah, I think, well, I'll give examples of some of the things that we've been doing. Yeah, I've been really shifting our organization. We're known for our legal work, and we do a lot of sort of big, bold sort of legal work and working. One thing that I like to say is just being really clear in our role that we are a strategic liaison between policymakers and decision makers, and then communities on the ground. And so we're trying to lift up the critical issues for communities on the ground to those in power, and just kind of translate those issues. And in doing that, how we communicate is really critical. I think that examples of like what we've been doing is, I'm really proud of we actually led the implementation of a $2 billion consent decree in city of Houston, in our city, around because of sanitary sewer overflows, and just basically, untreated sewage going back into our water. And so we're monitoring this decree over 15 years, and making sure that the city is doing what it said it's supposed to be doing in this decree and translating it to community. So up until this year, we launched a POO report, POO POO report, and it's like a cheeky sort of, the city is required to have a monthly report on how they're doing, and we translated that report to the community and create this a POO report. And it's really a cheeky thing because who wants to, folks don't even understand what a consent decree, let alone sanitary sewer overflows. People barely want to talk about when it comes to sewage. It's kind of a taboo topic. And so we do this POO report, and it's really cheeky, and we say this is how many overflows are still happening in these neighborhoods, and so we do that on a monthly basis. I guess so that's one thing I'm really proud of, is like inserting, these are really difficult issues, but how do we insert like a little levity into it but still understand like the urgency of the situation? So that's a good example of that. Beyond that, just thinking about sort of data to action tools, our approach to science is really rooted around community science. So we have a community science manager, and we pumped out several data to action tools to translate the data to make sure that it's accessible to community members. What else is there? And just maps as well. What I wanted to share was, there's the story of injustices, which we do so well through our actual work, and like litigation work. Our science works with our law work to make sure that we're like really fighting around water justice issues. But one of the things that we've been lifting up as a organization is really thinking about asset framing. And so asset framing is a narrative model that defines people by their assets and aspirations. And not only acknowledging challenges and deficits, but then what we've been doing is basically reconnecting people to their histories of water. Because, if we talk about these injustices, we're kind of starting from this place to say, like, all these communities are experiencing pollution, injustices, the loss of wetlands, increased flooding. But let's talk about like our histories to our waterways. Houston is known as the Bayou City. We have bayous interweaving and interconnecting between throughout our landscape, and water dictates so much of who we are. But how we tell the story around water is very white. It's very it's really sort of like a history of like looking at breaking down what conservation and natural resources history is. And there's not a lot of space for people of color, low wealth communities. And so what we're trying to do is do that asset framing to say that we exist and we have these stories of that connect us to the water. And a concrete example is that we've launched an artist in residence program, and I actually just met with our artist, our first inaugural artist in resident program fellow today. And I'm doing a pilot program for 6 months. And I really like this idea of having an artist in residence program at an environmental advocacy organization. And she's doing some digital archive mining to like recall stories of the water, really from a creative perspective. And she's gonna pump out a publication and do some storytelling around from an asset framing perspective and also from an injustice perspective. So we're doing a combination of telling the story of injustice alongside saying that we all have restoring cultural narratives to the water in terms of communities of color, but just from a larger, in terms of just an urban city, to like say we need to restore these connections more largely.
Mm. Thank you for that, Ayana. You dropped so many good things, and that really makes me think about both the opportunity and the necessity of using our communications and our stories to shift power dynamics, to rethink, or to change what are the dominant narratives around water and around climate. And so I'm going to open this question up for everyone here in the panel. Is how do we tell stories that undo the narratives that keep problem in place. And you alluded to this, Ashley, but more specifically, how do we approach communications with funders, and Scott, to your point, how do we change communications with decision makers? So I'll just open it as like, how are you using communications to shift power dynamics, and then we can make it more of a conversation now. Ashley.
Yeah, I think that like the most critical thing I see, and that I'm coming to terms with as like a 35-year-old, is that I'm no longer like the youngest person at the table. And that a lot of like Gen Z, Gen Alpha folks have such brilliant ideas. And especially for us who work on climate change has been a dominant source of anxiety for them like since they were born, basically. And they have a lot to say and really unique perspectives. So I think centering, like continuing to really make ourselves uncomfortable and center things that we never expected is so critical. And then I also think that something I've really learned is the most impactful work I feel like I've done over the past few years has all been led by artists. Like artists, they don't just like add something to our meetings. They can't just like do like pretty visual note taking or like little projects. They really have ways of thinking that are so unique. So I think the more that you can bring arts and culture makers, the like decolonizing practice of bringing elders to the center of our stories, I think is so critical. Um, and just doing more work that doesn't look like nonprofit work, that looks like what our ancestors may have been doing, the ways like sharing food. We did a great kind of a live Zoom where we had everyone like working on soup in their kitchen while we talked about climate stuff last winter. And so it was like we were all cooking food together apart, and it just changed how all those conversations went. So that's my thing. I just continue to try to push and be more curious about what are we not doing. Yeah.
And Ayana, you as we were preparing for this conversation, you shared how you bring those new perspectives into your relationships with funders. So I would like to share more about that.
Yeah, I think I'm, in my role, like interfacing with funding is, or, being the executive director, funding is really critical. And that's a big part of my job. I think that there's deeper work that I'm leading and shifting in our organization. And all of this is really around values. And I realized as we were trying to like redefine our website, like this past year, we're working on, we've started like a communications plan, which will launch next year, the beginning of next year. I'm working on a new website. We are finishing up a strategic plan, which will launch next year, and it'll be the next 3 years. And we're doing all this big work. And so I realized that what some folks were telling me is that we don't even have values. And so our organization created values, and the values have been really critical. That's the foundation of all the things that we need to do internally as an organization, whenever you're hiring anyone. Also, people don't think about values and how you interface with funders. And I think that as we're rethinking power dynamics internally in our organization, and one of the things that I've approached, that I've integrated in our power of rethinking power and how we fundraise is, well, first of all, I don't even say fundraising, I say mobilize resources. And so I've shifted the language around that, because language is critical, Jose, as we talk about so often in this work. Is that it's mobilizing resources. So it's not only about the funding, like we also think about what resources do our community, does our staff, does our organization need in order to maximize impact. Some of that, a big chunk of that is money, but there's in-kind donations, there's people sort of resources. And so rethinking the language, the historic language of fundraising to say mobilizing resources. The other piece is that in part of our strategic plan, I've used kind of integrated this language with fundraising to say that our approach to fundraising is to, I'm only interested in approaching fundraising to think about our funders as thought partners. I don't want to think about hierarchy in the fundraising. And as a Black woman leading our organization, interfacing with funders, there's histories of sort of power dynamics in terms of like the dance that we perform with funders. Especially as we serve, BIPOC communities and lower wealth communities, and the language that we use around trying to engage and to gain these funds, it just can sometimes you feel like you're selling your soul. So I actually think about this on a horizontal basis, that this is a thought partnership that I've told in my dialogues with funders, I say, I'd love for you to treat this as a thought partnership and to center reciprocity, that as part of you sort of mobilizing resources in your funding portfolio, that there are some goals that you have in your strategic plan that you need to enact. And so how can we as an organization with boots on the ground help you solve some problems? What questions are you trying to solve? We know that you'll help us solve problems in terms of mobilizing resources and getting us some funding, but also think about how we can help each other out. And so I think that that's one way to solve it. The other piece is that asking funders to like connect me to other, they ask me, well, what else can we do? And I say, well, what I'd love for you to do is connect me with other funders or make some connections with other leaders in the community. And I've gotten some existing funding through funders connecting me with other funders. I have a lot of thoughts about mobilizing resources and funding, and I get super excited about this and getting more funds for our organization in this new framework and a non-hierarchical framework that really calls out power dynamics. But I'm going to pause right there and pass it to whomever else.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's exactly, I think, what is needed is to acknowledge, because it's not that it wasn't happening before, but to acknowledge that it's a two-way relationship where both those who provide the financial resources also benefit from the knowledge and the connections that community-based organizations are also offering and bringing communities closer to them, and therefore checking what their strategies or aligning and making sure that the strategies are actually grounded on truth. Marcy.
Hard to follow that up, but oh my God, yes. All of what Ayana just said. And I was thinking as we were all talking, and both Ayana and Ashley talked about this, when we're looking at this, at our communications, we have this vicinity and this belonging in the community that allows us to really make sure that this is authentic. And so I want to call to that this is the importance of having people that are in the community actually doing this work versus folks kind of coming in parachuting that would spend, and this is also from a funding perspective, it's so much more efficient. And I'm not trying to get us into a lowest common denominator in terms of funding, but it's still very much more efficient to actually fund those folks that actually, putting money to people that are figuring things out or exploring, which I've seen so many grants on this. But it is a really, it's a really hard situation. As someone that is fairly new to fundraising, as someone who's been around for, actually, no, I'm gonna adopt Ayana's resource mobilizing. We're in an interesting situation that we only started looking for those funds in the last couple of years to grow. And it was really, it was really hard. We had this really exciting idea about music and arts, and just also having been kind of in this space where we were trying to make the most with very little all the time. And then you kind of adopt that, internalize that, and it's how am I gonna ask money? Who's gonna, it was very hard. And I sat on it for 6 months. How do you actually spend this money? Or is this, if you're not an arts organization, if you're not, this is not how things are done. And it helped to have some very, very good relationships with some of our funders that allowed us to take those risks. But it was, even with those close relationships, it was very hard to actually make the leap. And I, also making the leap in a way that wasn't, that gave us the leeway and the room to do things in the way that we felt had it to be done, and not get directives or like strong directives or guidance from one particular funder, et cetera. So that has been thankfully something that we are growing with, but it is an ongoing issue, I think, especially as a non-large or non sort of like mainstream organization.
Mm-hmm. And I feel like these communications and relationships and partnerships go on their particular circumstances whenever there's a crisis. When there's either a natural disaster in the region or a social crisis. Many times in the border, immigration has to do with it, but also when there's a policy or enforcement negotiation, there's those stresses are influencing our communication. So I'll go to you, Scott. I know you raised your hand, but also wanted to ask you, how have you observed those crises, those policy enforcement situations influence what's happening with communications in that space?
Jose, just a quick on the last subject about trying to find overlapping stories in fundraising. I see the same thing in problem solving environmental problems, at the enforcement level, at the government and local level. As I walk through people now, I tell everybody, let's take a full inventory of all your partners. And I use air quotes because, as we all know, everyone who's involved in the problem might not be part of the solution. So those might not be the partners that we have long-term, but at least you have to understand their perspectives and what they could bring to the table if they were more open-minded and more effective in their own responsibilities. And I've often seen, as you make progress with other true partners, those people who have played on the sidelines often want to join in and be part of the bigger success story. Heck, let's be serious. Everyone wants to be part of the success. Maybe not at the beginning because they don't know, but when they see it rolling down the hill, they know it's going to be good. So they really jump on board. And sometimes the bus, it just isn't big enough. So I tell all of my folks, let's go through each one of them. And this also gets out a lot of those feelings that need to be expressed, where the community has been marginalized, and the harm that has been done over years and years of neglect, or whether it be directed or just indirect neglect. You get all of that out so you can tell a more coherent, effective story and be a more positive storyteller than one that is not as positive in those tough situations. And then once you get your path towards a solution, then invest in those partners that give you positive advancement of the solution. And that makes it a lot better as you go forward. But as far as the crisis issues, being a federal official in Region 4, we had to deal with every hurricane and natural disaster and some man-made disasters like Deepwater Horizon that came up and got thrown in our face over the years. The one thing that I told people all along was, you need to have alliances, partners, people who know your story and have confidence in you and your abilities well before the crisis exists. It is not a time to get to know someone when the crisis is amongst us. You don't need to be looking for a fireman when the fire is blazing. You need to go down to the fire department and introduce yourselves and have an active relationship with those individuals well before that, and support them because they're supporting the community. Having the time and creating that forethought to connect to those people prior to crisis, I think, is the key for true crisis management. There are other techniques that we'll talk about, that we can talk about for a much longer time on true crisis management if you don't have some of those allegiance. But oftentimes our ability federally to reach out to state and local governments and state and local community leadership, that we could count on deliver a very effective message. Sometimes the message wasn't going to be great as far as the timing of our solutions to that community, but we trusted those people to give an honest brokership of those statements, because we had worked together for years, and they knew when I said, hey, it's going to be 2 weeks, we're going to get this done. I'm sorry it's going to take 14 days because I know you're suffering. They actually trusted us, and they knew my story well enough to actually make that connection and accurately communicate to the community. And we, got a lot of things done that way.
Mm. That's so true, and that's especially true, I think, for any conversation around reparations, right? And that's in many ways where the climate conversation is and gets stuck. I mean, we saw this at COP with the initiative to have those that emit the most compensate for those that don't. But we can see that in that conversation in Black and Brown communities all across the country. So I'm curious, how do you see communications and storytelling as a potential way to break ground for reparations? And a lot of this has to do with building trust, but a lot of it has to do with being courageous and being honest and restoring some of that trust. So I'll just throw that out there. I don't know if Ayana or Marce have done some reflecting around this. Great, and I see that we have some good questions in the Q&A too.
Yeah, I'll just say something. I see Scott's hand up. Do you want to go ahead and go, Scott?
No, please go ahead.
Okay. When it comes to this dialogue around reparations, is a challenging dialogue. It's a big word, and how it looks. There's so much to kind of unpack. And I think that trust is like a critical sort of keyword. That trust is still sort of like, we're still trying to restore trust with so many communities right now. And so I think, and we're also still trying to tell the story of injustice and like continued injustice that keep happening. And so I think that, really one example that we're doing, well, first I'll say one thing is that with Bayou City Waterkeeper, with our organization, just plan this, like, I think being clear on what our roles and our values are, this is like a really good example of that. And for us, I think that we play this role as strategic liaison. And so when we talk about communications, we are communicating to folks that are in our community on the ground. We are communicating to those in power and decision makers and policymakers and funders. And I think that there's an opportunity to lift up ways to sort of repair our communities. And when we ask for a change and we create change, we need to acknowledge that this work, and some of this is like, from a labor perspective, the extra labor that goes into this work, because we are not just like kind of creating change, but we're also sort of repairing and fixing problems that have happened. And so that needs to be part of the narrative. Like, when you give me funding, you're not just funding existing work, you're funding historic work that has done, things, harms in our neighborhood, in our neighborhoods, in our communities. And this is part of the labor equation in our current staff. This is where my staff is so tired, and how do you make visible some of this invisible sort of labor in terms of sort of reparations? I'm so tired in like the work that I do and trying to translate this invisible labor around water. Who is behind the scenes in terms of water? And we think about sort of the economic sort of perspective and like just making visible the things that you don't see. I think that's part of the reparations narrative. There's those people that we think that are folks that are in power, but what about the people that are in the water industry, that are like in the pump stations, that are, like, think about the whole kind of economics of water and how can reparations help in shifting the like landscape of like who has power in water. That's part of the reparations sort of equation. I guess I'll end and say that one of the things that I'm really excited about that we're kind of embarking on is that in order us, and for us, the work around water, and like many of us, like there's increased funding that is happening on like a federal level, and we're trying to pull down those funds for our communities. And that's a narrative strategy too, is that, okay, there's money out there to be had, but our communities need this money now. But what we realize is that part of that dialogue in centering reparations is also to talk about the story of disinvestment. That the reason that we have this history, this problem, is if you look at it from a financial perspective, in terms of an investment perspective, historically, we continue to disinvest, that there's a history of disinvestment in certain watersheds, in certain communities, and it goes beyond water. So all the more reason that we need to make sure that this money goes to these communities, because from a historic perspective, when you look at kind of decades of systemic sort of racism, and redlining, and all these things, that communities are under investment, and this has been enforced from kind of, so many sort of unjust racist policies. So how do you tell a story of like the thing that we don't talk about, of disinvestment, of people that just continue to kind of be looked over? So I think that we really have to unpack reparations and think about things like invisible labor, think about how we see disinvestment, and bring those forward in our narratives and in our communications.
Thank you for that, Ayana. And I think that's a perfect segue to some of the questions that our participants have dropped in the chat. So I'll go to that, but I just want to make a pause for those that need to jump off the call. It's the hour, and we have 15 more minutes for more discussion, but thank you everyone who need to jump off right now. And I'll go to Sarah to help us with some of the questions that we've received in the chat and in the Q&A as well.
Great, thanks, Jose. So this first one is submitted from Cheryl, who is the Vice Chief of the Waccamaw Indian people and works with American Rivers, coming to us from the lowlands of South Carolina. How have you all navigated bringing the EJ stories to the forefront without it being extractive, respecting where a person is at in what often has emotional experiences tied to grief, loss, and guilt?
If I can jump in, I think that the important part here is not, bringing somebody else's story to begin with. And I think that's the first start. I have had experiences in the past where even where folks were willing, they kind of stepped in with me into a place that was aggressive and extractive, and so it's something that's very strongly at the forefront. And I think the first part is like, sometimes we're not the ones that need to bring that story. People can tell their own stories, right? So like sometimes it's stepping aside and sharing the resources, and sharing the mic, and sharing the focus, and sharing, etc., because sometimes it's not our story to tell. I think that's the first thing that I would say for us, is like, do we have to get in the middle of this? Is this something we have to do? Sometimes, a lot of the times it's no. And that would be the first thing that we think about.
Yeah, I think that something that we've tried to do at Honor the Earth in the past year was paying creators for things they've already made. So especially with like a lot of young TikTokers who were telling their own stories, just being like, can we give them a stipend to keep creating content, and really like let them do it their own way, and then just elevate it. Or we've even just asked to repost videos and paid them a stipend for that. And then I just shared in the chat too a link to a video I made with Ricardo Levins Morales that talks about grief in a really broad way, but in a way that is like meant to be able to connect to people who are feeling it without putting someone's trauma on display. And then I think also creating closed spaces to do that storytelling with each other in a way that's like really trauma informed, having like with one of my old organizations, we did a thing called Breathe and Heal after the legislative session to talk about like the violence that we experienced at the Capitol. And we had body workers. We did like we made like little healing sprays. We had medicines from different cultures there. And if people wanted to share their story at the end of it, like that was presented as an option, but it wasn't the center of what we were doing. It was really just something like if this would be helpful to you, we'll create space for it.
I'll add to that. There's two things. One is being clear on what stories we don't tell. And I think that speaks to kind of what Ashley was saying, that we do, as we are engaging with community, we internally as a staff, there's a lot of sensitive issues that are coming up. And so sometimes that story doesn't need to be told to the community or to the public. And just holding space to say, like, we're trying to create action, connect the person to legal resources. And connecting folks to legal resources and just fighting for people for change. But like sometimes we choose not to tell those stories and just being okay with that. I would say the second piece is like an example of a project that we're working on is in order to like center community stories that sometimes community members, like we're actually working on providing media training for community members to tell their story. And so providing a workshop with it where a journalist will teach them about sort of writing their story for community journalism, audio storytelling, and then also actually photojournalism with their phones. And then providing some sort of like health centering so that as we facilitate them telling their story, they also can have an opportunity to think about, we're speaking with a social worker to like think about how we center ourselves. So actually providing like a pragmatic tools for them to tell stories.
Thank you, everyone. And yes, I would add that I think it's essential to think about storytelling as a relational work and not just think about like, products or outcomes or videos or like whatever we're trying to say, but to think about it as a relation. I think that's and that's what we try to do with when we connect with journalists, is try to connect journalists with the community voices and make relationships. We have another question. I'll go to you, Sarah, for the next one.
Great. So this comes from Kelly, who is calling in on Oahu, Hawaii, and wanted to ask about gaining trust of the community when the founders of their organization are not of Native descent.
As the Native person here, I guess I'll just be like, pay Native people, hire Native people, stipend Native elders. We don't ask elders for anything without giving them a gift in exchange. And a lot of them won't accept cash, so frequently we'll do like grocery store gift cards, food that's culturally relevant. But there's really I can't provide any way of gaining trust besides actually putting in the work to gain that trust. And sometimes that means like going to an elder's house and like chopping wood for them, bringing them a meal, like actual real world relationship building that has to happen.
I love that. And I think this not only applies to these principles not only apply to organizations where the founders are not of Native descent, but also organizations that are, white led, that have staff that are people of color and that are working with communities of color. That there's this connection, but there's also this disconnection, and there's different levels of trust there. Anyone else wants to share any thoughts?
I mean, I'll just say that I'm the first Black leader of a historic white organization. And I think that the previous staff, it was before I came along, or maybe 5 years ago, was 2 white women leading the organization. And there was some really great work that was done to lay the foundation to do some of the bolder work that I'm doing. And I just want to I think that it's important to just center people of color in this work, especially if you're serving people of color. It's not always the case that you can do that. And so I think that I have there's some good allies that are in leadership that I'm working with. And, it's just important to sort of, for leaders to sort of just check, white leaders to just check their values and to kind of think about ways to work with people of color and to lay that foundation and to call out what you can't do as well. But I think it's, that is the history of this organization. And it, I think that because of previous work that was done, it allowed me to be and work with less traction, less traction.
Well, just apologies, but for what's happening in the chat, that person was removed from the webinar, rightly so, but just threw me off. I think we have another question in the chat, Sarah from Maritza, I believe.
Yes. So Maritza says, thank you for sharing so much with us. What role do you all see healing and grieving practices in helping us tell the hopeful stories that can create a future where it's harder for us to fall into systems of fear and oppression? Because so many of us have inherited fear and traumas that oftentimes make it easier for us to perpetuate white supremacy. Curious if you have thoughts around that.
I actually have to jump to say something real quick, which is like there is an amazing book called The Politics of Trauma, which is all about the connection between somatic work and movement building and movement, like different kinds of justice, and has like amazing stories and applications. So thank you guys for hosting me. I forgot I have another meeting I have to get to.
Thank you so much,
Jose.
Ashley.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll say that, first of all, I just want to just kind of like pause and just acknowledge that this space of trauma in the chat in this very moment, that it's just so much a part of the work that we do. And, so it's just important just to kind of call it out and just think about how this really affects us in doing this work on like so many levels. So it's so exhausting. But I think that, can you tell me the question again, Jose?
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of long, but let me paraphrase it for you. I think Marisa is asking about what do we see, or what do you see as the role healing and grieving practices can have in helping us tell hopeful stories. So what I'm getting is, how do we balance grieving and healing so that they don't kind of like pull us down, and still acknowledging that aim to have hopeful stories. And I'll just share that I think that what comes to my mind is by not avoiding grief. I think that grief is a first necessary step to acknowledge the pain that lives in our communities. And otherwise, like Marisa says, I think we're ignoring and further contributing to white supremacy. But I'll open it for you to reflect on that.
Well, I just wanted to say that one of our values that I'm super proud of is regeneration. And so, and that value has allowed us to create spaciousness around the very element that we're fighting for, that water is a regenerative part of our lives. And so how do we create space for regeneration as we do like this very hard work that is, we think about sort of the extractive sort of nature of water and the like all the injustices around water. And so I think that we create space for regeneration in this work, and space for uncertainty, spaces for reflection. And I think that it's just like spaciousness in this work to just, I think we get into action mode so much. We try to solve, we're like solvers, we're trying to solve the thing, but we're in this moment where there's a lot that we don't know. And so maybe it's just the space just to pause and build that into our daily work, build that into our meetings, build that into our strategies, and build that into our communications as well. Like, we don't always know the answers, and we also want action and change.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We're approaching the time for our session today, so I want to just take this chance to thank all of our panelists today. Thank you, Ayana. Thank you, Marce. Thank you, Scott, for joining us. Thank you, Sarah, for supporting us with the chat. Ashley had to jump off, and then I'll just give you a chance to share some final thoughts around storytelling. And yes, please, those that are still in the session, please take some time to fill out our survey. It helps us improve our trainings too. But yeah, Marce, Scott, Ayana.
Yes, it's again emerging from this space of scarcity and finally being able to start to kind of move past it. One of the things that doesn't get thought of enough in the space of scarcity is both that healing and the celebration and the joy, right? Like, somebody asked us the other day, is like, do you all have space for joy? Do you celebrate your wins? And it just came to me that we really hadn't, because we're in this like one-to-one, and we try, but not enough. And you're in this framework where folks want to move past the issues and the backgrounds and etc. into solutions. And sometimes that's a way of like ignoring their responsibility or our responsibility, etc. And that's something that's very frustrating and obviously just kind of festers there. So again, healing is definitely something we're trying to engage. Joy is the way for us. And that's, you can see that in the matter what child put there, like music, spoken word, and now our very, very famous parties. So dancing and joy for the ocean. Ask anybody. We bring a live band. We have the live music, and like we bring people together in a space of joy and in culture for the ocean. And that's something that, again, took a long time for us to step into from the funding perspective, but it's something that's so exciting and just brings that space and kind of like keeps us going for the rest of the year. So that's exciting, and we're excited to explore more of that. And I'll put the link for the whole project there.
Nice. I love that. Scott.
Just want to pass on one. I didn't get a chance to talk about the reparations that I've seen happen in the Southeast in the last several years that are really fantastic. It's the removal of low-head dams and large dams on waterways that have blocked historical fish migrations and those things, especially those dams that were put in below tribal lands that cut off traditional heritage to the fishing connection and the waterway, have happened in the Southeast over the last 5 years. And it's so amazing to see that happen, and the bringing together of those large industrial, very profit-minded individuals to try to re-support the historical damage they've done on tribal lands and other lands. It's been fantastic to see. Hopefully more of that will occur. I will only give one pitch to all those people who love water like Ayana. There's about $1 billion in the Biden infrastructure bill to specifically remove dams, and hopefully communities will take full advantage of that.
Ayana, any final thoughts?
Oh, it's just good to be in dialogue. I'll say I'll share a book that I'm reading that I'm really proud of around asset framing, is Undercurrents of Power, which is about aquatic culture in the African diaspora. And I've just been nerding out, like looking at getting these wonderful visuals of West African cultures, like diving into the waters. And then the final one is around joy, just leading with joy, and just centering joy just in my own leadership. It's just been great to think about that and like healing justice. So thank you so much for having me. It's just been good to be in this moment.
Yeah, thank you. And with that, I'll just share a thought that internal internal regeneration comes together with external regeneration. So thank you everyone for joining us, and see you in our next session. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye bye.